Greetings and welcome to our daily walk through the scriptures for August the 21st. Your readings today find you in Job chapters 4 through 7, 1 Corinthians 14, 18 through 40, Psalm 37, 30 through 40, and Proverbs chapter 21, verse 27. Now, there's actually a common theme between several of our readings for today, and that has to do with our tongues, with our mouths, and what comes out of them. Proverbs 37, the mouth of the righteous utters wisdom, and his tongue speaks justice. So it's not matter, whatever we say, we have to be careful what we say, but it's not just what we say, it's how we say it. And this is how Paul talks about it, and we actually see a pretty good example of it in the book of Job. Let's go to 1 Corinthians first. When Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians, he spends the whole chapter 14 talking about spiritual gifts, specifically speaking in tongues. And the reason why is because speaking in tongues is a very unique spiritual gift. It is one that, unless you do it in the proper context, it is often either a tool for self-glorification or it's a tool of frustration, meaning that how you say it and what you do may or may not have any benefit. This is the reason why Paul says that in many ways, speaking in tongues is the weakest of the spiritual gifts, because it doesn't have value unless it's done within the right framework, as long as you have an interpreter, as long as it's done in orderly fashion, as Paul talks about when it comes to the worship service. Tongues is one of those things that is for just believers only. It's not for anybody else. It's not for people that are looking for Christ. And so that is an important aspect of it, is that we have to be aware that not only of what we say, but how we say it, the context of what we do, the value of making sure that we're being sensitive to the situation. And this is why Job actually comes into play really well here, because Job has some friends that show up, okay? Job has really 4 friends that show up. And over the next several chapters, you're going to get each one of them coming up, and they're going to start doing speeches, okay? And you're going to have each one of them, you're going to have to bear with it, because Job, again, is very poetic, and so it might seem a little difficult, and so to extrapolate some stuff out of it might seem a little difficult. But Eliphaz, who's the first one that comes up and speaks, the problem with his theology is that it has no heart. It has no grace. Basically, he's going, you reap what you sow, as he says in chapter 4, verse 7. He kind of through 11, he's kind of that. In other words, you're suffering because of sin, and you reap what you sow, and he has no mercy in his heart. Eliphaz does. And this goes back to what we're talking about in 1 Corinthians. We have to recognize the grace that God has given us, and we need to speak through that grace. We need to make sure that the justice that comes out of our mouths, while it might be justice, also has that soil of grace. We need to make sure that we're giving grace to people, because we live in a world right now that doesn't want to. And if we're being really honest with each other, Christians, we're not the best grace givers. We aren't. We look at the world and we see what the world is doing, and we just wag our fingers at them. You shouldn't do it. It's wrong. It's wrong. Without grace, without understanding that they don't even yet know grace, that the world has no experience with the grace of God, and it's us that are supposed to show that grace so they can experience it. If you look at the interactions that Jesus had with sinners, Jesus always spoke truth. He always spoke truth. The words out of his mouth were always justice, and yet they were also always tinged with grace. The one that Jesus didn't have grace for was fellow Christians, for people that were supposedly supposed to be his followers, the Jewish leaders. He didn't have much grace for them because they chose to ignore grace. They used to recognize that they even needed grace. The world needs grace. The world needs our tongues of justice, our tongues of truth. But we don't need to be heartless. We don't need to be without mercy. We need to make sure that our theology is always based on a soil of grace, because that is how we were first saved. It's through the grace alone, found in faith alone, through Christ alone. This is why it's so important to make sure, just like Paul warned in 1 Corinthians 14, that we're aware of what's going on around us, that we are not becoming stumbling blocks for people that don't know Jesus because we're making ourselves high and mighty and separated in such a way that they cannot even see God because we've removed ourselves so far away. All right, that's our conversation for today.